The 2024 NFL season preview for the NFC South, more specifically the New Orleans Saints. We are here. Check the mic with Steve and Sam. You may remember these two hombres from PFF. We reacted to a ton of their videos all throughout the last year. I like PFF. I'm a big fan of Pro Football Focus and then all the analytical groups. They are one of many that I look at throughout the week. So I didn't realize this until this video, but Sam and Steve have left PFF for greener pastures at 33rd Team. 33rd Team, we have reacted to some of their videos as well. Similar type of situation, breaking down the game on an analytical level. So, tip of the cap to Steve and Sam on their new venture. Wish them the best, obviously. I'm a big fan of these guys. I like what they do. They see the game through the same lens that I do. And I think you're going to see a lot more, I've talked about this in the past, of people seeing the game through that lens, or who is kind of the next wave of these NFL thinkers or football thinkers. For example, one of their coworkers, Zach Robinson, does that ring a bell? He is now the OC of the Atlanta Falcons. He was previously just working, just like they are, or were, for PFF. I watched their going away stream. They talked about working alongside Zach Robinson. Bobby Slowick, the OC of the Houston Texans, was a coworker of theirs at PFF. So this, it's crazy to think about either one of these two hombres being an OC, but that is kind of the line of thinking that football is moving forward. So all that to say, good luck to these two guys. Good luck to 33rd Team, and good luck to PFF, whoever fills their shoes. Okay, so today, like I said, they're doing their full NFC South preview. We're not going to watch the entire thing. It's over an hour long. I can't imagine their Panthers section is that long. But we're going to watch the New Orleans Saints section, and it's only about 15 minutes long, and we're going to react to that.
Sitting at that spot.
All right, let's go to the New Orleans Saints. To me, one of the more disappointing teams in 2023, not because I think they were a great team. Yeah. They had one of the easiest schedules in the NFL. Really, the NFC South had all easy schedules, essentially. And the Saints, I think, they had what looked like the most stable quarterback position going in.
So what happened with the Saints, and it's easy to point to like the schedule and all that stuff, and I was on here saying that the Saints could win 12 games because of how easy the schedule was. If you look at the Saints year, and I told you the offensive line is going to be the worst offensive line in football, we will not have a running back go over 80 rushing yards in any game. We will not score on the opening possession of 16 of our 17 games. If I told you all that, you would be like, man, we're probably like a 5 or 6 win team. Like, that's horrible. You cannot overcome that. No team can overcome that. The Saints had a lot of glaring holes, namely the pass rush, namely the offensive line, namely Pete Carmichael. And the problem was those glaring holes were so glaring that the schedule and all that just didn't really matter. Like, the fact that we won 9 games, the fact that the Saints were had a winning season, they tied for first place in the NFC South. They lost on a tiebreaker. The fact that that team could have hosted a playoff game, on top of the fact that Derek Carr missed 2 halves of football, very important halves of football, specifically the Green Bay game. The fact that we were that close to beating teams like Jacksonville, Green Bay, Houston, who at the end of the year, were pretty good. Indianapolis, end of the year, was pretty good. Like, these teams, obviously we played some really bad teams, but it was one of those weird seasons where directionally everyone was right. Schedule is weak enough to where you can back into wins. That's exactly what we did. We backed into a ton of wins. We went 4-2 in the division. Problem was, where we were bad, we were so bad that it just tanked the rest of the season. And it's easy to say Derek Carr sucks or Dennis Allen sucks. Fact of the matter is, we couldn't run the football. We had a horrible offensive line. We had absolutely zero pass rush, and Pete Carmichael existed. That's it. That is what the season boiled down to. It wasn't Dennis Allen. It wasn't Derek Carr. It wasn't Chris Olave. It wasn't Alvin Kamara. It is those things I just listed was what tanked the season. That's it. That is it. And tanking the season with the schedule that we had was 9 wins. And a Foster Moreau catch here or a Derek Carr shoulder there or a missed field goal turned into a made field goal here, and we're a 10-11 win team that won the division. And thank God we didn't, because Pete Carmichael would probably be back, and we'd be spinning our tires, and everybody would be patting themselves on the back, acting like last season was a good season when it wasn't. And a lot of the times results can be false, and that would have been false if we were a 10 or 11 win division champion, because that team was terrible, and we needed to make changes, and we did make changes.
Into the season last year, before we knew Baker Mayfield was going to break out, and they finished 9-8. It was the same record as the Bucs. They lost the tiebreaker. They don't win the division, but it feels like the Saints should have won the division last year. And they're in an interesting spot here, Sam, because they're the team you always like to reference. They max out the credit card, right? They keep pushing the credit card balance into year after year, and it's like, when's it going to come back to bite? And I think you're slowly seeing the depth on the Saints roster get a little bit more depleted.
Now, this is where I start to push back, because if you compare the Saints last year and compare the Saints this year, you have to admit they're better roster-wise. The roster this year is better than last year. So I do not agree with this idea that now you're starting to see the credit card debt or whatever come back to haunt the Saints.
Been one of the better drafting teams in the NFL over the last 10, 12 years. I think that's slowed down just a touch. It's year 2 of Derek Carr. What do you look at?
See, I would push back on the draft thing, where the last handful of years we've drafted pretty poorly. But PFF, these two guys themselves, gave the Saints an A+ for the draft this year. So the draft hasn't slowed down, because this year was probably the best draft we've had in 5 years.
Looking for the Saints here, and their big stories heading into 24.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing for me is Derek Carr, I think, had a slow start to his career in New Orleans.
Yeah, for sure.
But by the second half of the year, Derek Carr was actually playing some pretty good football. So does that continue heading into year 2? Like, did he just take some time to acclimatize and get used to a new offense and new receivers and all those kinds of things?
Which Derek has admitted, the change, the switch to New Orleans, the human aspect of it, finding new schools, finding new whatever, did take a toll on him.
And now Derek Carr is going to be who he thought he was going
to
be when they signed him? Or is he just that inconsistent, and you can't necessarily rely on him playing at a very high level for half the season? If they can get him playing at that level and he picks up where he left off, then I think the Saints are back in the hunt as a genuine division winner, even with Atlanta having Kirk Cousins now, and even with Tampa Bay having discovered Baker Mayfield, if he backs that up. But if Derek Carr is just that inconsistent, that's the concern. So I think he should theoretically be capable of playing at a very high level. They've got receivers to play with, even if that group has had some turnover and maybe been depleted. Chris Olave, I think, is a really good player. Rashid Shaheed.
Let me give you a hot take. It's easy to say Derek Carr is the storyline because he's the starting quarterback. He's the guy who got the $100 million contract. But I don't think Derek Carr is the storyline. If you told me Derek Carr played the exact same way he played last year, I'd be like, okay, that's probably about, all right, that's fine. Like, sure. Obviously, I don't want him to miss 2 halves of football. But if you just told me he played about the same level, I would say we can win the division with that. Like, this idea that it's all up to Carr being a certain style of quarterback or a certain level, I do not agree with. The storyline is 3 things. 1, Clint Kubiak. How much of a difference is this new offense versus Pete Carmichael? I think it's a tremendous difference, because I watched the Saints. I watched every snap of the season last year. Watched every single play call, every single decision. Watched it. Horrible. We were 15 years behind everybody else. Pete Carmichael was cosplaying as Sean Payton. It was not good. All right. So how big of a difference is, for the first time in 20 years, having a new offense, an updated offense in New Orleans? I mean, we were operating on a computer that was 15 years old, and now we just upgraded to top-of-the-end graphic card, top-of-the-end processor, top-of-the-end storage stuff. It's going to make a difference. That's storyline number 1. Storyline number 2 is the offensive line. Obviously, biggest question mark. Last year, the offensive line was really bad. This year, the offensive line seems to be right around the same. Can they stay healthy? Who's going to play where? Can they be average? Can they be the 20th offensive line in the NFL? Can they somehow put it together enough to be an average offensive line? Can we run the football? All of that. And then third is just how good is the defense. I think they could be a top 5 unit, especially if the defensive line plays how they did in preseason. They'll be a top 5 unit. And if you have a top 5 defense, all of a sudden your season is very, very different. The Jets had Zach Wilson last year, all right? And they still won games because they had a top 5 defense. If the Jets had Derek Carr last year, they're a playoff team, 100%. So if Kubiak is as big of a difference as I think, if the offensive line can be average, and if the defense is top 5, those 3 storylines are way more important than is Derek Carr elite or can Derek Carr get back to his highest level.
Is an outstanding deep threat and gimmick type of receiver. He can take, screens, all those kinds of things. You got some young guys now in A.T. Perry who made a really nice play in preseason. His first week, Bob Means, the low drafted guy this year, rookie. And then it's a case of what is that offensive line going to look like? Because that group has completely fallen apart over the last few years.
Before I want to touch on the line and those playmakers you talked about, but the other factor here is they're going with the Friends of Kyle strategy when it comes to offensive coordinator. They're bringing in Clint Kubiak, who was the passing game coordinator for the Niners last year. Of course, Gary Kubiak and all it's the West Coast tree. It's where's the tree start? Is it Mike Shanahan? Is it is it Gary Kubiak? But it's Friends of Kyle. This has worked recently. The last pass game coordinator that went from the Niners to becoming an OC was Bobby Slowick, turning the Texans around with C.J. Stroud.
This obviously works. Like, if you look around the league and you look at Bobby Slowick, Mike McDaniel, Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, you look at some of these guys, it works. This right now is the optimal way to run an offense. It is what it is. So we have the pieces to do it. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the difference in Pete Carmichael, is that not only are we changing from an antiquated system, we are switching it out for something that has been proven across the league to work. Something that's proven across the league to right now be the way to move the football.
This feels like it's a lot to overcome, though, because of the offensive line. And what you and I have said, sometimes it seems like that scheme can overcome the bad on-paper offensive line, the offensive line that looks like, I don't know if they can do a whole lot, but they scheme it up really well. They use angles really well in the run game. They protect the quarterback through the scheme, through getting receivers open quickly. But this one could be too much to overcome here, Sam. There's a lot of moving parts here. Ryan Ramczyk has been one of the best tackles in the league since 2017, since he was a first-round draft pick. He's injured. He's out at right tackle. They're moving former first-round pick Trevor Penning from left tackle to right tackle. Penning has been banged up and underwhelmed when he's been on the field. They drafted Talise Fuanga in the first round out of Oregon State. He played right tackle at Oregon State. He's moving to the left side. And then your guards are Lucas Patrick, Cesar Ruiz, most likely. Neither of those guys has been great in the majority.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. Like, that's the storyline. The storyline is the system has proven it can hide deficiencies on the offensive line, but it can't hide the worst offensive line. It can hide the 20th, 21st offensive line. I think the Niners last year were the 21st offensive line. They're fine. Like they get hidden. So we just need this line to be below average. That's it. If they're somewhere in between the 18th and 24th offensive line in the NFL, I think this scheme can work. It's not going to work if they are the absolute worst offensive line. So that is kind of the rub with the O-line question.
Part of their career, they're good at center with Eric McCoy. So you're literally talking about 4 out of 5 positions that are questions.
Yeah.
And when I like to look at an offensive line, the O-lines that I say are good, the ones where I say 4 out of 5, I feel good about, right? That are not question marks. And if you have one question mark, all right, that's fine. We could probably work around that. But we're talking 4 out of 5 question marks up front for the Saints.
Yeah, you hear the 80-20 rule all the time, right? In business and all kinds of things. That's the offensive line is the 80-20 rule as well. If 80% of your line is good and 20% is bad, you've got one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. If 80% is bad and 20% is good, you might have the worst offensive line in the NFL.
You can't 20-80 the offensive line. It's the old.
Now where I'm at, I do agree. But where I'm at is that it's a total unknown. It's so many moving pieces that we can't just assume they're bad. We can't assume they're good. We just have to wait and see on this one. It is a question mark. If the 80, because right now 80% is unknown, I would say 80% is totally unknown. We know we know what Eric McCoy is going to do for the most part. If after week 2 or week 3 we're like, okay, it's not unknown anymore. They're just kind of below average. If that's the answer, very different outlook. If we see after a couple weeks that, oh, this ain't good, this is bad, okay, very different outlook. But I don't think it's fair either way to say they're going to be good or they're going to be bad, because you're just guessing. So everyone has to accept that right now, when it comes to this question, we're just not going to know.
Old adage in business, you cannot 20-80 the offensive line. So
y'all hear the sirens? I mean, it's every day. It's insane, the sirens that pop off in downtown New Orleans.
I've got concerns there. And Derek Carr, he's not the best when he's got he's under heat all the time. No quarterback really is. I don't think he's the type of guy that overcomes.
You'd be crazy not to. Man, I have
poor
a lot
pass
of
blocking or even poor run blocking that puts them into 3rd and longs all the time.
What in the world?
It's going to be tough to overcome up
It's
front.
like I'm drinking sand.
Yeah, it is. It's been,
Jesus.
that group has really eroded, and they've tried to repair it. There's some 3 first-round picks are on that offensive line right now. 2 of them haven't worked out, and that's part of the problem. Like, Cesar Ruiz hasn't been a good player on the interior, and then Trevor Penning so far has been injured and a disaster. And then obviously Fuaga, the rookie, we haven't seen from him yet. But that's a problem, right? Anytime you spend multiple high draft picks at a position and it simply doesn't work out, you are behind the 8 ball, particularly if you were relying on those positions and actually contributing right away. And the Saints have been that style of team. Like, they have been the type that relies on their drafting and targets players and earmarks them for significant roles.
I would argue that this part is way more of a problem for the Saints than the salary cap. The fact that we are whiffing on draft picks is much more of a problem than this whole kicking the can salary cap manipulation. The fact that the Peyton Turners of the world, and the Isaiah Foskey's of the world, and the Trevor Pennings of the world, and the Cesar Ruiz's of the world, the fact that they're not contributing is a really big issue. Really big problem. That is way more concerning than us, being under the cap and then getting over the cap and under the cap and all that stuff.
With the confidence that they're good at this, they can draft players, they can identify talent, and that'll fix a position. And when you swing and miss multiple times at that, you put yourself in a problem spot, and that's basically what's happened to them on the offensive line.
And I would say Derek Carr is similar to that Kirk Cousins situation, right? We've seen years where Derek Carr was a top 10 caliber quarterback, produced like a top 10 quarterback, and other years where he was closer to 20. And he's somewhere in the 10 to 20 range, closer to 20 probably at this point in his career. But he could give you top 10 quarterback play. He's got to play better in the red zone. Remember, that was a key story for the Saints last year.
I think a lot of that was play calling early on. Play calling got very different in the red zone, became very, very field goal reliant. It became very run, became very safe. Towards the end, they kind of changed things up, but it was a little too late.
Playmaker-wise, you mentioned some of the guys. I think Chris Olave, excellent player. Rashid Shaheed's ability to get behind the defense is just unbelievable and extremely consistent. Juwan Johnson has been a little up and down at tight end, but he's shown the ability to stretch the seam. And they're talking up Taysom Hill, even though he's, almost our age, Sam, almost in his 40s. Taysom Hill, we're going to line him up all over the place. He's going to be awesome again. So,
and they did in preseason so far, and he was awesome. So the Saints do have playmakers. I think they have better overall, right around the same, if not better, than the Atlanta Falcons, who people consider the best weapons in the division. I would say the Buccaneers probably are the best weapons in the division, but the Saints aren't starved for offensive playmakers. It's shallow. We don't have a ton of depth, or really any depth. We have depth at running back, but the Saints are one of those teams where it's like, okay, if Chris Olave is your number one, okay. If Alvin Kamara is your number one running back, okay. If Taysom Hill is getting touches, all right. Rashid Shaheed, you can win games with that. You can win games with that unit. You look at a team like the Packers, it's like, man, that's a pretty weak pretty weak offensive like weapons. A lot of teams like that would love to have Chris Olave. A lot of teams like that would love to have Taysom Hill or even Jamal Williams, so or Rashid Shaheed. So the Saints aren't starved for offensive weapons.
Taysom Hill aside, I mean, I think the playmakers are legit for the Saints. The O-line just got to hold up a little bit better. And then I think defensively, kind of similar questions. They had one of the better defensive lines in the NFL just a few years ago. Lose a Trey Hendrickson, you lose Marcus Davenport, Cameron Jordan gets a little bit older. You're trying to replace all those guys with several top draft picks, and the jury's still out on a whole bunch of those guys. The Peyton Turners of the world.
No, I think they just suck. And unlike the offensive line, we replaced them on the defensive line. So we're not relying on Isaiah Foskey and Peyton Turner. We went out there and said, all right, Chase Young, Carl Granderson, Brian Brzee, Cam Jordan, that's kind of your front. That's kind of your four. We're not going to just sit here and say, I hope we get something out of Peyton Turner. Like the offensive line is still saying, I hope we get something out of Trevor Penning. So the defensive line went the other route. Our linebackers are really good, especially after getting Willie Gay. I mean, Willie Gay and Demario Davis, really good. And then Pete Werner, good player. Our secondary, you could argue, is the best secondary in the NFL. Jordan Howden, that's not a bright spot, but everything else is top tier. Like, Tyrann Mathieu and Marshawn Lattimore and even Kool-Aid and the Alontae Taylors and like the depth in our secondary. So if we get what we have been getting out of our defensive line this preseason, I would say you can go ahead and earmark the Saints as a top 5 defense.
Well, the Brian Brezees of the world, Isaiah Foskey's of the world, all these guys, first and second round picks. They need those guys to step up and get the Saints defensive line from really one of the worst the last couple of years back to where they were when they were the best team in the NFC South for a couple of years.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Like the Saints had a run where they were one of the best drafting teams in the NFL, and they had a ridiculous strike rate throughout the draft, which is still a relative crapshoot. But they were really good at this, and that's when the Saints were at their best. Their talent was really good. They were able to restock.
Any team, if you hit in the draft, especially how the Saints hit with some like all-pro level players, any team you're going to be catapulted to having a really, really good window to win because you have a good core, probably on cheap contracts. That is the best way to win in the NFL is to hit on draft picks at that level. Like players that can come in and be impactful. Bengals are a great example. You hit on Joe Burrow, you hit on Jamar Chase, congratulations, you have a Super Bowl window. The Saints, same thing. You hit on Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, you hit on Ryan Ramczyk, you hit on some of these players, boom, guess what? Welcome to the Super Bowl window.
With the draft, they brought in a bunch of fixes. And then the last couple of years, they've sort of hit the downside of that. They've hit the bad end of variance, and the wheels have fallen off. And just a ton of these high draft picks that they've spent on both sides of the ball simply haven't worked out yet. And we hit the ones in the offensive line, but Peyton Turner was a high draft pick who hasn't contributed really at all. Brian Brzee, okay, the jury's still very much out on him, but he didn't look an impact playmaker year one. They need him to be significantly better.
He had agreed. Like last year, he was a good rotational player, but he certainly wasn't an impact that you'd want out of a first-round pick. So far in the preseason, it seems like he has taken a step.
This season, Foskey, as you mentioned, has not made a real impact yet. Like these are players that they need to show up in a big way. Otherwise, that defensive line is extremely depleted. And okay, Chase Young coming in is an interesting gamble to try and potentially fix that on a relatively sort of buy low proposition, roll of the dice. Cameron Jordan is still a good player despite his age. Carl Granderson is useful, but the big X factor or the thing that's going to determine how good this defensive line is at least two of those three high draft picks that we talked about before, Brzee and Foskey. Like, are those guys actually going to take a significant step forward, or are they going to be more underachieving high draft picks that become...
I've seen enough out of the defensive line so far to where I'm closer to saying that that will be a good part of the defense. Whereas the offensive line, a lot of it's still a question mark. I'm comfortable with the offensive line or the defensive line right now.
Like let down areas.
I've been bullish on the Saints the last couple of years, even last year, right? I mean, I thought that they could have done more. 9-8 isn't a disastrous season. I thought they had 10 or 11 wins in them just because of the schedule.
They did.
They should have a favorable schedule again this year. If we're talking best case scenario, I think all of these question marks that we're talking about, the youth movement on the offensive line, relying on young players at tackle, the defensive line relying on these younger players to step up, like all that needs to come good essentially. And then you're talking about the Saints, I think, competing with the Falcons for the division, and it's the same expectation, right?
100%.
Maybe win the division and sneak a playoff win if you get the higher end of Carr throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best case scenario for the Saints is probably similar to that of the Falcons, right? It's you win the division, you maybe win a playoff game or two. I don't really see it including being a truly elite team, Final Four, Super Bowl type of thing.
100% agree. Best case scenario for the Saints is you do get the most out of Kubiak. You do get the most out of your new defensive front. The offensive line is good enough. Chris Olave takes a step forward, and you win the NFC South with 10 or 11 wins. That's the best case scenario. And yeah, you are not a Final Four team. You are not a legitimate threat to win the NFC. You're not a legitimate threat to win the Super Bowl. Obviously, you get in the playoffs, anything can happen, but, I 100% agree. And I would say that's probably the exact same best case scenario for the Falcons. And I would say that's probably the exact same best case scenario for the Buccaneers. Which is what I've been saying the entire time, is that these three teams are not that far away from each other. It is a 11-win, 10-win, 9-win, 10-win, 9-win, 8-win. It's one of those situations. So, and that's what I've been really trying to harp on, is that in no circumstance do I see any of those three teams, barring some insane injury, but I don't see any of those three teams being that bad, nor being that good. I don't see the Falcons winning 2 games. I don't see the Bucs winning 4 games, 3 games. And I certainly don't see the Saints winning 1, 2, or 3 games like people have tried to say over the last couple of weeks. This is a mediocre division top to bottom. I would say it has a relatively high ceiling. I mean, 10, 11 wins, okay, with a relatively high floor as well. It's not an exciting division, but it's just a average to above average division with teams who are competitive enough, with playmakers at decent positions to not lose that many games, but the top end isn't that high either. Top to bottom, I think the NFC South is probably better than like the AFC West. The AFC West just happens to have the Chiefs in it. But the Saints, Bucks, and Falcons are better than the Raiders, Chargers, and Broncos. I would say by a pretty wide margin.
I don't really think they have that in them, but if things do go right for them, they've got enough talent that they could still win that division when nobody should be dominant, and potentially beat a couple of teams in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario, I think it's. I hope we're not skewing too negative here for the Saints in our discussion, but I think it's the worst roster that they've had in the last 9 or 10 years, since.
Absolutely not true. It is better than last year. That has to be a fact. Like that is to me, that's not an argument. To me, that is not a multiple choice question. It is a straight up fact that the roster this year is better than last year, especially when you factor in the coaches. But even if you take out the coaches and just factor in the roster, it's better. No doubt about it. So I got to push back on that. Worst case scenario for the Saints, lost season, 7 wins. You're 7-10. What really is bad about that is that if that's the case, you're probably forced into a pseudo rebuild. Because if you go 7-10, the Carr experiment is over. More than likely, the Dennis Allen experiment's over. More than likely, at that point, you are transitioning from this core group of Alvin Kamara, Cam Jordan, Demario Davis. We all know Tyrann Mathieu, some of these older players, older contracts. And you're probably saying, all right, we got a bit of a youth movement going on here. We're probably getting away from Carr. We're more than likely moving forward with Haener or Rattler. We're going to start trimming some of thing contracts and trying to start the next window. So that's the worst case scenario, is that 6-7 win world where we're forced into turning the page and starting the next chapter of the New Orleans Saints. We've known from the jump that this Carr era is max a 4-year era. I think it's going to be closer to a 3-year era, but it could be a 2-year era, depending on how bad this year goes. If we're 9 wins, 10 wins, yeah, Carr will be there for the 3rd season, for sure. But this is not a Derek Carr comes here, Derek Carr gets an extension, he's the quarterback for 8-9 years. That's not the case. You know, I think everyone agrees, or everyone agreed in the room, you know, Mickey, Dennis, Derek, that everyone knew what this was. This was a short-term bridge that with a high ceiling. You know, it's not an Andy Dalton bridge. It's a Derek Carr bridge where, yeah, if everything clicks, this team could host a playoff game. This team could win a playoff game. But in the worst-case scenario of a lost season, that turns into a pseudo-rebuild real quick.
It's maybe the middle of the Drew Brees era. Maybe we'll say more question marks now than they've ever had, especially on both lines. At the same time, they've had that ability to, you know, play some lockdown defense and step up at times and get the most out of their players. But worst case scenario, I think the O-line is a disaster. I think that affects Derek Carr. Yeah. And you get the low end of Carr. Maybe you're talking about Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener taking over at some point just to see what you have. Thinking about moving on from Carr at some point during the season. And the defense, all the talent that they've lost over the last few years just comes back to bite. I mean, I think those are all possibilities this year.
Yeah.
I think a worst-case scenario looks very similar to the Jets last year, where offensively it's just like we can't really do much of anything. Offensive line is so bad we can't run the ball, we can't throw the ball. System cannot work because of the offensive line, but the defense keeps you in games. You win a couple you're not supposed to. Your schedule's relatively soft. And you worst case, you are in that 7-win world, whether it's 6 wins, 7 wins, or 8 wins. But that's really about the floor, I think, for this team.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like their worst case scenario though is still pretty high. You know, it's still a reasonably high floor. They're too good. There's too much talent in this roster for them to be a total and utter catastrophe outside of the standard injury caveats that is true for everybody. So I think like the worst case scenario for them realistically is they're not better than last year. The teams around them have potentially gotten a bit better, certainly in Atlanta's case, and they just sort of struggle to playoff missing mediocrity, right? And they're in that 6-7 win type of range.
Agree 100%.
Where they're outside of a top end draft pick, but they're never really threatening the postseason.
The one thing I want to add before I want to talk.
Well, I mean, like, think about like me and these two hombres right here, like what we're saying. And then you think about what like Colin Cowherd and Kurt Benkirk have been saying for the last 2 weeks, where the Saints are one of the worst teams in the NFL, potentially the worst team in the NFL, a 1-win team, worse than the Carolina Panthers, does not have a win on their schedule, and Dennis Allen will be the first coach fired. Like, juxtapose that with this. You know, they're not even close. That's what's blowing my mind about the recent, 2 weeks of all this anti-Saint stuff, is that it's not even in the same realm. It's not like they're saying, yeah, the Saints could be a 4-win team, because 4 wins and 6 wins, like, okay, whatever, have a conversation. But the worst team in the NFL, 1 win, not a win on the schedule, all of that, we can't be that wrong. You know, these guys, no offense to Colin or Kurt Benkert, but these guys are much more tuned into what's actually happening in the NFL. I would assume almost everyone at PFF and 33rd team is more tuned in than those two. So it's hard to believe that I and them are that wrong to where we're not seeing this team as the 1-win team that Kurt Benkert and Colin Cowherd do.
Talk about a key position or player. There is a lot of potential at corner. Marshawn Lattimore getting a little bit older, but I think he's still capable when he's out there. Paulson Adebo coming off a really good year. The ageless wonder of Demario Davis in the middle of that defense. They just re-signed Pete Werner. I mean, they do have talent on that side of the ball.
Yeah, really good defense. Really good defense.
To affect opposing quarterbacks and make life difficult for them. I just think they need the D-line to step up as we talk key position group. To me, it's the defensive line. Who is it going to be?
Agreed.
Do they?
It's the defensive line, offensive line. I mean, that is the big question as far as the roster, because obviously, like I said, another big question is the coaching. But offensive line, defensive line. If we get a pass rush, if we just get a pass rush, our defense is going to be insane.
They get the best of Chase Young. They took the 1-year flyer on Chase Young. I'm always willing to take that chance because I think he still has the opportunity to get back to where he was earlier in his career before the injuries. One of the Peyton Turners or Brian Brzee of the world affecting the quarterback. One of those guys needs to step up.
And I think Brian Brzee is going to be the guy because I think Carl Granderson, Cam Jordan, Chase Young are for sure. We know they're going to be the guys on the field. So who's the fourth? I think it's going to be Brian Brzee.
And then key position group-wise, the two tackles, not only Penning trying to prove himself, but moving from the left side to the right side. Fuanga moving from the right side to the left side as a rookie. A lot of moving parts and question marks there. But if those guys, settle in, that helps a ton and might offset what I thought would be the worst-case scenario where the offensive line is really struggling.
Yeah, I think the entire offensive line for me is the key unit. Every position is almost every position is a question mark, like you said, 80% of it. The 80% of it, I think, we just need to figure out what that's going to be. Fuanga is a really talented guy. That guy absolutely moves people.
Yeah, Fuanga's looked good so far. I mean, he's looked good. It's been very little. It's a preseason couple games. He's also battling the back injury. But from what I've seen so far, Fuanga looks good. Is he a Hall of Fame left tackle? We can't say that yet. But he looks like he will be able to at least be average.
Once he makes contact, he's pretty solid in pass protection, but he is flipping sides. Trevor Penning has not been good in the NFL. But
no, he is not.
He's like the classic old school road grading right tackle, which doesn't really exist in today's NFL because right
really
tackle, left tackle, it's basically become the same thing. So if he couldn't hang on the left side, there's no real indication that he's going to be able to do it.
Penning looked a little bit better in the last preseason game, but I mean, we've seen a couple of years of bad. We're going to need to see more than one preseason game of good.
But on the right side, because it's not a hiding place anymore, right? So if he's just not able to play tackle, he might be your guard. And
it's
the
almost
interiors,
incurring more risk because you have two guys flipping sides, so they're both trying to get comfortable.
I am kind of surprised they didn't move Penning to guard and keep Fuanga at right tackle.
I was surprised positions that are of equal importance.
Yeah.
But the solution now to a guy like Trevor Penning, who's, powerful, strong, but is really struggling from a technique standpoint, the solution to that now might not be flip him from left tackle to right tackle. It might be flip him from left tackle to left guard, right? Yeah. That might be the solution to those types of players. But either way, it's a real concern and a risk for the Saints right now.
100%.
All right, man, let's wrap it up with the Tampa.
I think they were on it. I think they were on that one. I think they were right there. Yeah, I agree 100%. I want to see where they had best case. So for the Falcons, their best case scenario is win playoff game and then or NFC South champions. The Bucks, they have best case Mayfield repeats 2023 success and repeat as division champion. So agree. So I mean, these guys are spot on with all the teams. They didn't go crazy. We saw Rich Eisen say that the best case scenario for the Buccaneers is the Super Bowl. So I mean, not to discourage, not to demean anybody or whatever, but it's obvious who is watching these games. It's obvious who's doing their homework, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much for watching it on down below. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching again. I appreciate it. Peace.